beautiful baby boy.
Henry Parkes was born in Canley, England on the 27th of May 1815 into a world undergoing tumultuous change. The overly ambitious French imperialist, Napoleon Bonaparte, had just surrendered his stranglehold on Europe. And Britain was struggling through the Industrial Revolution. And it was with this historical backdrop that Henry's father, Thomas, was forced to sell their farm and take the family to Birmingham to find work. At the age of 12, Henry was forced to work in a brick pit and rope walk, earning 4 pence a day. I was breaking stones on the Queen's Highway with hardly enough clothing to protect me from the cold. As early as 1832, at the age of 16, Henry was involved with the Birmingham Political Union, championing the plight of the working class. While Parkes was cutting his teeth in industrial Birmingham, another man with a famous Australian name was visiting the Galapagos Islands. Both Charles Darwin and Henry Parkes were progressive thinkers. In very different ways, both men would challenge and affect change to the status quo. In the same year, surveyor General Thomas Mitchell visited and described the lands surrounding present-day Parkes. Determining its suitability for future settlement, the area would not be built upon for a further 18 years. In July 1836, Henry married Clorinda Varney, a 23-year-old butcher's daughter. The ceremony took place in the Birmingham suburb of Edgbaston. Around the same time, the People's Charter movement had gained suffrage across Britain for every man at least 21 years of age, sound of mind, and not undergoing punishment for a crime. Parkes himself would later advocate universal suffrage. Despite broad disenchantment amongst the British populace, mainly due to financial hardships brought about by the Industrial Revolution, the coronation of Queen Victoria took place in 1838 at a cost of £79,000, approximately £6 million by today's standards. This grandiose spending did little to appease the radical left, including the Chartist movement, intensifying anti-monarchy sentiment across Britain. The Industrial Revolution had caused widespread discontent in Britain, and so it was that after numerous failed business ventures in Birmingham and London, Henry and Clorinda decided to set sail for Australia in search of better prospects. Upon their embarkment, Henry Hetherington, a leader of the British Chartist movement, published verses from Parkes' A Poet's Farewell, which he wrote before beginning his long journey south. I indignantly condemn a society through whose injustices men like this are compelled to seek the means of existence in a foreign wilderness. Parkes and his wife, who gave birth to a daughter, Clorinda Sarah Parkes, en route to Australia, arrived in Sydney on July the 25th, 1839, where Parkes immediately began work as a labourer in an ironmongery. Throughout the following decades, railway routes through New South Wales were under construction. Establishing links between Sydney and the western settlements, this network grew to include the area that is now the Parkes district. The 1850s and 60s saw Parkes establish himself as both a talented writer and political activist, gaining recognition throughout New South Wales as an advocate of universal suffrage and, later, federation. As the owner of several newspapers, such as The People's Advocate and New South Wales Vindicator and The Empire, Parkes voiced his opinions on political issues and the struggle for Australian self-governance. He was also able to publish his own poetry and articles supporting Australian culture. As Parkes began to map out the future of Australian politics, the expedition of Burke and Wills set out on their ill-fated transcontinental journey from Melbourne to the Gulf of Carpentaria. Seeking to map the entire region and dispel the long-held theory that a vast inland sea occupied Central Australia, the two men perished on the return journey. The Battle of Fort Sumter, which took place in South Carolina, USA, marked the beginning of the American Civil War. The date was April 12, 1861, and the war would rage for 4 more years. Ending with a victory to the north, the war came at a terrible price, culminating in the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln. Parkes would later draw upon the difficulties experienced by the United States when outlining his ideas for an independent Australia. After becoming a member of the New South Wales Parliament during the 1860s, Parkes became a force in early Australian politics. He was elected as Premier of New South Wales in 1872, when he became a strong advocate for change, campaigning for the cessation of transportation of British convicts to Australia. As well as a stronger role for Australians in governing their own colonies, the tyranny of distance had long been held by Parkes as one of the main pitfalls of British imperial control within the colonies. He saw self-governance as the incontrovertible solution. During this time, the state of New South Wales was transforming geographically as well, with the areas west and northwest of the Blue Mountains becoming more accessible to settlers. In August 1873, on a tour of the western settlements, Parkes visited the town of Bushmans. So enamoured of him were the people of Bushmans that in December 1873, they decided to rename their town in Parkes's honour. Throughout Parkes' first and second terms as Premier, a young outlaw by the name of Edward Ned Kelly was on the loose in the Victorian and New South Wales countryside, wanted for numerous bank robberies. In response, Parkes put out a £4,000 reward for his capture. On March 10, 1879, Parkes received a personally addressed letter from Ned Kelly, warning him of the dangers he posed to any man who attempted to claim that reward. Parkes saw Kelly as a manifestation of the flaws in the imperial government's handling of the colonies. Whilst in no way did he condone the violence and theft, he could understand the plight of a young man who had been unfairly ostracised by the authorities and forced to take drastic action. The following years saw massive growth in public support for a federated Australia. Parkes personally instigated a number of land and immigration measures that defied the imperial authority of Britain, leading to widespread calls for a federal convention. Slowly, each of the colonies began to subscribe to the idea of federation. Initial fears, held primarily by Queensland and Western Australia, that a new federal government would be dominated by the more populous Victoria and New South Wales, were dispelled.
The great question is whether the time has now arisen for the creation on this Australian continent of an Australian government and an Australian parliament. I believe this time has come.
In 1899 and 1900, referendums were held throughout the colonies to decide whether they should come together to form a nation. The bill passed with a majority vote of more than 60% in favour of federation. The nation of Australia was born. Unfortunately, Parkes never lived to see his dream of a federated Australia come to fruition. Having served 5 terms as Premier of New South Wales, he died of natural causes in Sydney on the 27th of April 1896. Over his life, he had 17 children and 3 wives. He was 80 years old. Henry Parkes was hugely influential in shaping the destiny of our nation. Few realize it was he who first campaigned for a bridge that would cross the famous harbour. Even fewer that he was a chief instigator in changing popular views regarding women and the vote. He left an indelible mark upon the nation's medical industry, writing to Florence Nightingale during the 1860s, requesting nurses for New South Wales. He was instrumental in the transformation of our early education system, overcoming a raft of political and social issues to ensure education was free, secular, and compulsory. His vision and forward thinking was a driving force behind the construction of our early national railway network. He recognized the vital need to encourage and enable trade between states, which would only be possible via an expansive network of railways connecting Melbourne, Sydney, Adelaide, and Brisbane. But it was his passion and dedication to a united Australia, with shared values and traditions, that marks him as a truly iconic Australian. The township of Parkes, and indeed all Australians, can be proud of all that he achieved. He was one of the founding forefathers of modern Australia and is rightly known across Australia as the Father of Federation.